Well, my business today is, of course, an impossible one. That is to say, is convert the members of the strict observance to a proper appreciation of the great reformer, Jean de Rancé. And I have little hope of succeeding, but I shall do what I can. There's no doubt that he is gravely misunderstood. He was at the root of the strict observance, who most Cistercians of strict observance do not like at all, and certainly don't appreciate. But part of the reason why they don't appreciate him is because they tend not to read him. This includes both French-speaking and English-speaking Cistercians. And for the English group, part of the reason for that is because although Rancé wrote a very great deal, not a very great deal has been translated. The translation of his masterpiece on the sanctity and duties of the monastic life was translated actually by a Cistercian abbot back in the 1840s, but the translation is very seriously flawed. The abbot had no hesitation in adding little bits, sometimes missing out little bits, or paraphrasing as he wished. And although at the moment I do in fact have a new translation of that work, De la Sainteté, underway, I estimate that if I live to be 127, I should just about complete it at that time. But we'll see what happens. First of all, let me correct what is often an error. He is not de Rancé. What we say is, in fact, in French, is that if you have something before the de, like Monsieur de Rancé, or the Abbot de Rancé, or l'Abbé de Rancé, then he's de Rancé. Otherwise, we just call him Rancé, and that's it. And he is unquestionably a controversial character. He's unquestionably a difficult character. He's a character tricky to understand, and you can't understand him apart from his time. He's 17th century, and 17th century France is not 21st century North America or anywhere else for that matter. He is very much a man of his time. He was, his full name was Armand Jean de Boutellier de Rancé. He was aristocratic family. Once he actually entered La Trappe, more about that later. He dropped the family name de Boutellier and never ever used it again. He was born in Paris on January the 9th in the year 1626, and he was one of a number of surviving children. He had 2 brothers, he had 5 sisters. The family was well-to-do, was very well-to-do in fact, and had close relationships with high personages of power, both in the court and in the ecclesiastical hierarchy. In fact, Armand Jean de Rancé was called Armand Jean after his godfather, who was no less than Cardinal de Richelieu himself. That was why he was called Armand Jean. And Cardinal de Richelieu was a staunch supporter of the family for as long as he lived. And when Rancé, rather precocious young boy, at the age of 13, produced his first book, which was written in Greek, he dedicated it to his godfather, Cardinal de Richelieu. No bad thing to have Cardinal de Richelieu as your godfather in 17th century France. But, as always, you had to keep a very careful eye on the politics. And in fact, the Rancé family was quite seriously affected by changes in the political system of the time. Well, as I mentioned, he had 2 brothers. His elder brother was called Denis Francois, Denis Francis, Denis Francois, and he'd never been a robust child. He was always rather sickly, and he died in 1637 at the age of 17. His death was not unexpected. It was sad, but it was not unexpected. And then a major change occurred. The family had originally intended Armand Jean, our Rancé, to pursue a career in the military. And his elder brother, Denis Francois, who, as I said, had just died, was due to pursue a career in the church. This all changed on the death of Denis Francois, and Armand Jean now had to leave aside visions of a military career and took over where his elder brother had left off. Now, the important thing was that Denis Francois, his elder brother, possessed a number of valuable benefices, abbeys, priories, monasteries, of which he was commendatory abbot. I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. He was commendatory abbot or commendatory prior, commendatory superior anyway, of 5 religious houses in various scattered places of France. One of these was the Cistercian Abbey of La Trappe in the wilds of Normandy. Let me say at this stage that the Abbey of La Trappe was in the wilds of Normandy, and it was in extremely dilapidated condition. When I say in the wilds of Normandy, I mean in the wilds of Normandy. We have to remember that it was extremely difficult to get to and extremely difficult to find. We know that people had to have guides in order to find it because it's set in the middle of forests. It's not now, of course. If you want to visit La Trappe today, you go to the railway station, which is only a short distance away. You get off the train and there's a nice big high road that leads you right to the gates of La Trappe itself. But in these days, this was not the case at all. And it was inhabited by probably just about half a dozen monks living in really disreputable squalor. The purpose, however, was for Denis Francois and for any commendatory abbot, more in a minute, was not in fact to live a religious life, but to make money. So, for the moment, brief pause while we talk about the commendatory system. It was a French system, it didn't happen in England. And a commendatory abbot was an abbot who was not elected by his own community. He wasn't elected by his own community. He was appointed by the Pope or the local ruler, and in France that was very often, usually the king. He was appointed by the Pope or the local ruler, normally for services rendered. In other words, we have particularly bishops, clerics of high status who had served the king in some way, done good works for the king in some way, and was therefore rewarded by being appointed abbot of a particular monastic community. And the business, for the most part, it wasn't always the case, but for the most part, these commendatory abbots were really interested only in getting whatever they could from the resources of the monastery, whatever incomes came into the monastery, whatever the monastery made in income terms. A small proportion went to the monks to try to keep themselves and their buildings in order, and the rest went into the pocket of the absentee landlord. And some of these absentee landlords, i.e. commendatory abbots, made a fortune from the abbeys. Denis Francois has 5 of them. He might not have made much from La Trappe, but some of the others brought in a very considerable income. I mean, in fact, we know precisely how many thousands of livres, pounds, French pounds, he was actually making at this time. And it was really a very large amount. So to be commendatory abbot of 5 religious houses was a very profitable business indeed. Not all commendatory abbots were like that. Most of them were, there's no question about it. I can't give a percentage, but I were to guess, I would say 85-90% of commendatory abbots were simply interested in reaping the resources of these abbeys, which were technically in their control. There were a few who, in fact, tried to do something. Rancé wasn't the first to try to reform the lax system of the day. There were a few others, but they were very few. They were very few. And generally speaking, the commendatory system was an absolute disaster, just an unmitigated disaster for the whole of French monasticism, Benedictine, Cistercian, whatever, it doesn't matter. It was really a disastrous situation. So Denis Francois was commendatory abbot of these abbeys. So far as we know, so far as I can recall, he never visited. He died, I remember, at the age of 17. He was sickly. I think he never visited any of them. Anyway, Rancé inherits these commendatory abbeys and priories. So there's money here to be made. There's money in this. At the moment, he's not going to visit them. He'll visit them later, but that's in the future. So, for the moment, Denis Francois has died in the year 1637. He's born 26, so he's only in his beginning of his teens. And then his education begins at home by tutors. We know the name of the tutors. One of them, Favier, was a remarkable man. And there's no doubt whatsoever that the young Rancé was a very bright cookie indeed. As I mentioned earlier, his first book was produced at the age of 13. It was an edition with commentary of the Greek poet Anacreon, and it was dedicated in Greek to his godfather, Armand Jean de Richelieu. It's an extremely rare book now, although I know where there's one copy in a Cistercian library, which I'm not going to mention by name. I found it there. I was unbelievable. I said, I can't believe this. And the Father Abbot actually, after I was given some talks on Rancé, the Father Abbot said to me with great courtesy, said, if you wish, you may have this book. And I said, I could not possibly take this. It's worth more than the Abbey put together. So the book is still there. Anyway, the book itself, whether in fact how much help Rancé had from his tutors, from Favier and others, we don't really know. But there's no doubt that he was a very brilliant boy, a very brilliant lad. Then he went to university, entered the Collège d'Harcourt at the University of Paris. And all the evidence indicates that he was an intelligent and dedicated student, and he took his Master of Arts degree in 1646, so just 20 years old. 1626 he's born, takes his Master of Arts degree in 1646. And he is, of course, destined now for the ecclesiastical career which he inherited from his brother. So 2 years later, he was ordained to the diaconate. Who ordained him to the diaconate? Someone called Paul de Gondi, and the name may not be familiar to you, but he became in due course a cardinal, Cardinal de Retz, spelt R-E-T-Z. And in other words, there's a good, strong link with high ecclesiastical personages here. And then in 1651, just a couple of years later, he was ordained to the priesthood by his uncle. And who was his uncle? No less than the Archbishop of Tours in France. So you can see that there is really close relationships with very powerful personalities in the church. We're not just talking about any ordinary person here. We're talking about someone with very important, powerful networks behind him. Very powerful. Now, so he's ordained priest in 1651. The year before that, his father had died. That's in 1650. So then, not only now has Armand Jean inherited the benefices of his elder brother, who is now dead, but as the eldest son now, he inherits, of course, his father's property, because everything comes at this time to the eldest son, not to daughters, of which there are 3 or 4, 5 in fact, sisters. So he is now not only associated with some very powerful figures in the church, some of the most powerful figures in the church, he is also extremely wealthy. He's also apparently very good looking. He loved to hunt. He loved to hunt. He adored hunting. And he was also renowned as a very fine preacher. There was one time that he met a friend of his who, I won't bother with the name, but who would later become Archbishop of Paris. And the future Archbishop said to him, he said, Rancé, what are you doing today? How are you? All this sort of stuff. And Rancé said, he said, this morning I shall hunt like the devil, and this afternoon I shall preach like an angel. And he was known for the excellence of his preaching. How much this was rhetorical verbiage, we really don't know. But this was an age when the sermon as an art form, as a rhetorical art form, was much esteemed. And a fine preacher could fill the churches like you wouldn't believe. I wrote a book recently called A Saint in the Sun, which was a translation of some of these sermons. And we know that some of these preachers like Bossuet, preachers like Bourdelot and so on, the churches just blocked solid just to hear. And we're talking here about sermons which were an hour long at least, some of them an hour and a quarter. That was par for the course. So the 7-minute quickies, which we're used to today, they wouldn't have bothered with that at all. They wanted good, solid, rhetorical, florid, magnificent French meat in their sermon. And they got it. And there's no doubt that we have no record of any of what Rancé actually said in these early sermons. But given the nature of his later conferences, which are effectively sermons, we can be sure that it was stately, ornate, no, not too ornate, but stately French, very well delivered. And in his time, as a young man, extremely popular. There was actually a joke that used to go around that an hour was just right because, of course, it says in one of the Gospels that, you remember, the Holy Spirit shall give you what you shall say in that hour. And that hour was the hour of the sermon. So you knew exactly how long you'd got. Anyway, he was a fine preacher, apparently, and he liked it. He liked the adulation, there's no question about it. And he was rich, good-looking, and so on. And when his father died in 1650, Rancé inherited, of course, all his possessions, including one which would become of particular importance to him. This was a chateau, a castle, south of Paris, about 140 miles south of Paris, called Veretz, Veretz. Still there, the chateau is still there with the grounds, and Rancé absolutely loved it. He loved the place and spent as much time there as he possibly could. We'll meet him at Veretz again very shortly, and at which time we shall also meet somebody else at Veretz, whom the Cistercians frantically try to show was only a platonic friend, which is Arab nonsense, as we shall see. So Rancé, rich, good-looking, good preacher, making his way at court, lots of big connections both in the secular world and the ecclesiastical world. Everything laid out for him to become a French gentilhomme, a gentleman of leisure and wealth. God had his eye on him, however, even though Rancé did not know it. So 1650, 1651, he becomes a priest. By 1654, he is a doctor of theology of the Sorbonne. And a year later, 1655, his uncle, that's the Archbishop of Tours, sent him as a delegate to the General Assembly of the Clergy of France. This was a sort of a great synod of all the clergy of France, where their business was to determine the state of the French Church, the nature of the French Church, what the French Church was doing, where it was wrong, and where it should be going. It was of major consequence, these general assemblies of the clergy. They tended, however, like all general assemblies, then then and now to be long, boring, wordy, and not get very much done at the end of it. This is not something which should be unfamiliar to you. And that was the case here. He did everything. We know that we have reports of his of what he did there. He did everything that was required of him. But he found the proceedings too long, found the proceedings too boring, and before the assembly had concluded, it went on for some considerable time. Rancé, he's around about 30 years of age now. He very quietly slipped away and travelled down south to his beloved chateau at Rance. And there we will leave him just for the moment. That was the first stage. Because the second stage is where we get quite dramatic.